Okay, this is our last history lesson, and we will finish up Kennedy today. And I hope you'll join me for our summer sessions. I'm starting next week, and I'll continue guiding us through the presidents. And I hope you can enjoy learning about some of the other ones too. Okay, so JFK continues. He's 35. He is on the 50-cent piece, and he still is. Okay, so here's the 50-cent piece. This is one of his campaign posters, Kennedy for President Leadership for the 1960s. Okay, so his kind of name for what he wanted to do, his agenda is what it's called, was called the New Frontier. And we didn't talk about this yesterday, but he was the youngest president elected. He was not the youngest president in office. Theodore Roosevelt was by just a little bit, but Theodore Roosevelt wasn't elected into that position. So he was the youngest elected at 43. And so he comes in and he promotes this idea of what are these new things that we can explore as a country. What we need, kind of an action. What are we going to do? And he starts with saying this. That's a very come to be one of his most famous quotes. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. So it was the idea of we need you to act and you to play a part. Don't just let us do what we are going to do. And I think this appealed too to that. This was how that World War II generation lived. Not what they can do for me, but what can I do for my country? So that was kind of launching his new frontier idea. Cold War is continuing. We are still at not physical fighting war with Soviet Union, but it's awfully chilly. You know how if you don't get along with someone, you say, ooh, it's cold in here, right? It's chilly, it's frigid. So we're about to have a little bit of a problem. In Cuba, and I gave you this map because I want you to see how close it is. This is Cuba and this is Florida of the United States. So very, very close. I told you that at the end of Eisenhower's term, the leader of Cuba was overthrown by Castro. And when Castro wasn't dealing in a friendly, open way with the United States, Eisenhower shut down trade between Cuba. And when we did that, Cuba went to who? The Soviet Union, right? So one thing that Eisenhower had kind of got going before he left office was that the United States was supporting people who had been exiled from Cuba and helping them to get ready to have an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro. So it wasn't the United States Army, but it was the United States supporting these other people and kind of putting their force behind these exiles so that they could overthrow Castro. So they were supposed to go in and they landed at a place called the Bay of Pigs. And they landed at Bay of Pigs, and we were supposed to have, America was supposed to bring like airplane support, overhead support, and it wasn't there. And this invasion was a complete failure. And so very early in his term, Kennedy had to take credit or responsibility for this huge kind of flub, which is a huge mistake in this takeover that didn't go well. So then, so it heats up a little bit more in Cuba, but before that happens, in August of 1961, remember I said that after World War II, Germany was split in half, and part of Germany was given to Communist Soviet Union, and part of Germany was given to France and Great Britain and America. Well, the France, Great Britain, and America all kind of came together, and that became one part. And then East Germany remained in control by the Soviet Union. Berlin was the capital of Germany. Berlin was split right down the middle between half of it Soviet and half of it free. Okay, democratic, like how we do things. Our country is. So if you lived in the Soviet Union side and you were being told how much bread you could have, what job you could have, how much education you could have, where you go to school, what your job is, if you were being controlled like that, and most of your money's being taken away, and everyone is kind of in these poor situations, you can't speak out against the government or you're jailed and taken away. But yet right over there, they have freedom. Right over there. Okay, they can do whatever they want. They can go to whatever school they want. They can set up businesses. What are you going to want to do? Go over there, right? I'm just going to go. So people started leaving, and Germany and East Germany, Soviet Union, realized, no. This is not the way we want it to go. You can't just leave. You have to stay here. So almost overnight, these people woke up and there was a wall. East Germany had built a concrete wall separating East Germany from West Germany, and they were not allowed to cross. So overnight, there were families that were separated from each other. If your dad went over there to work and find work, and you were left over here, you were overnight separated. He couldn't get back and you couldn't go over there. I read a really good book. It was a juvenile historical fiction about this idea. A girl that was trapped in East Germany, and there were many people who tried to dig tunnels under the wall, and of course it was heavily guarded, and you could be killed for even trying to escape. But there were many people that risked their lives to get out, and it wasn't until the 80s that the wall was knocked down. 1980s that the wall came down. It was up for all of that time, 20 years, over 20 years. So they build their wall, separating East Germany from West Germany, and basically showing how serious they are, that their side stays communist and no one interferes with what they're doing. Then in 1962, we get information that Soviet Union has come to Cuba and is building a nuclear missile base in Cuba. Now, remember the map? Here's Cuba. Here's us. Do you think that a nuclear missile would do a lot of damage coming from Cuba? Yeah. Remember all those fallout shelters people have in their backyards, and the drills that they're having at school for if we're bombed? That's what they're afraid of. Okay? So this is the closest the United States ever came to entering nuclear war. And this is about the time I'm really sad we didn't get to go, but this is the only time the Greenbrier bunker was almost used. It was commissioned to be built by Eisenhower. I should have mentioned that with Eisenhower, but it was commissioned to be built by Eisenhower. It was built by a private company, so no one would know that it was the government having it built. They kept it going, kept it active. And I'll try to send you some videos on this so that you can see more about the bunker. But it was a place for Congress to go if we were ever attacked. And that way, Congress could still function, and it would be a safe place underground for them to go. So this is the closest time, the time where it almost was used. So Kennedy immediately ordered the Navy to surround Cuba. So basically a threat. and basically dared them to break their barrier, and said, look, we're not moving. We're not doing this. We're not playing this game. Okay. Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union, removed the missile for a promise that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. Okay, so, all right, we'll take our missile base away, but you're not allowed to invade Cuba, meaning Cuba's dictator could not be overthrown. They were going to remain communist. So we'll leave, but you got to leave them alone and let the dictator. And Castro stayed leader for a long time and was awful. He was Cuba had nothing. Those poor people. People tried to get away on rafts and escape to Florida for decades because of just the misery of being there. But part of the reason we never did anything about it was because of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that was our promise. There would be no missiles there, but we had to leave Cuba alone. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, there was already some problems with communists trying to take over Vietnam, and Eisenhower had sent some military advisors over, and Kennedy increased the military advisors. I think there was a couple hundred over there, and Kennedy increased them by the thousands. So no one really knows what's going on in Vietnam, but at this point, but there is something going on over there, and Kennedy is sending people over to figure out what's going on, and that's building, and that's gonna come later. Okay, 1961, Kennedy creates the Peace Corps, which is still in existence today, and the Peace Corps helps developing countries, and it sends doctors and teachers and just people over that are going to countries that are developing, that don't have as much as we have, to help them out, to give education, to give support in different ways. And part of the reasoning behind this, though, was still the Cold War, because we are hoping that the more people that we can send over to these developing countries, that we can slow down the spread of communism. Because how communism takes over is they come into these very weak areas and say, hey, don't you want money like everybody else? You're poor. Let's all share the wealth. Well, it doesn't work out the way everybody wants. It doesn't work that way, because how do you have money to give everybody bread? I take your money, okay? You give me your money. You give me your money. You give me your money, okay? I'll buy the bread, okay? So you give me money, you give me money, you give me money. You've given me $500, all three of you together, okay? I have $500. I buy bread with 200 of it. I keep the rest. I keep the 300 in my pocket. And then I take the bread and I tell you how much you can have. I tell you how much you can have. I tell you how much you can have. Does that sound like a good thing? No, but everyone loves this idea of equality. Oh, we're all going to be equal. No one's going to be richer than me. We don't like the idea that someone has higher than I do. But guess what? A lot of those people earn it. They have earned it through their own work, through their own sweat, through their own smartness, have earned that money. And that's the way it is. We don't all start out the same. And that's just the way the world works. But remember, nothing's free. So if someone comes in and says, hey, I'm going to give you free this, free this, free this, free this, don't be fooled by that when you are old enough to vote. Don't be fooled. Because nothing's free, and where are they going to get it? They're going to take more taxes from you, from everybody, and split it up, but they're going to have more and more control over what you can have and what you cannot have. So that's the danger of communism. So he was hoping that the more people he sent and the more help that they would receive, so that these nations would be stronger, that they would be more ready to fight the spread of communism. Okay, We still have the civil rights movement really, really steaming up. Remember, we talked about Rosa Parks. We talked about Martin Luther King Jr., who was a young preacher who was kind of moving this nonviolent protest method of standing up for civil rights. We have a group of people called the Freedom Riders that board buses in D.C. and they ride all the way through the South and refusing to give up their seats. And many of them were beaten at every stop. They were called names. They were awfully treated. And this kind of forced President Kennedy's hand to intervene and help them. He was for civil rights, but he was a little slow in moving to help them because he was afraid of, if you're a politician, you're afraid of how it's going to seem to all sides. So this kind of forced his hand to protect them at every stop along the way. And so they went all the way through the South and did their ride successfully. Then in 1963, there is a civil rights march. Over, I think it was 250,000 people marched. And when I say march, like they got on buses and came from different places. They didn't go on foot all the way to Washington. But they all arrived in Washington and had this big gathering at what's called the Mall, right in front of the Washington Monument. And Martin Luther King Jr. stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial. The Lincoln Memorial was behind them, and stood and spoke to all of the people. And this was a walk to be heard for being treated equally. It was a walk for jobs, for the idea of being able to have the same ability to earn an income as anybody else does. And this was where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream that one day my children will play alongside white children. And it was this idea that this is a dream, that this could happen. And one day I have a dream that this will happen. And what's cool is this march was not, when you see pictures of the people there, it was not just black people. There were black and white people there, because there are white people, remember, all the way back in the abolitionist movement, that have tried to help African Americans and have stood up for them. It's not, you can never say of any people, well, all people are this way. All white people are this. All black people are this. All men are this way. All women. You can never say that. And from even the beginning of time, there were white people that were trying to help and stand up for the rights of African Americans. And so in this crowd, you have a mix of all kinds of people, not just African Americans. Okay, the space race started right at the end of Eisenhower's term, but is still continuing. JFK comes out in his New Frontier kind of a forceful way and says he promises that we will land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. So that means he was in the 1960s. Before 1970, we will land a man on the moon. And that was daring speech, wasn't it? But this was basically a challenge to the Soviet Union. And it was a challenge to the people to say, look, we're not going to let those Soviet Union communists beat us in this. We are going to do this too. And come on, let's do this. And it was just a frenzy. Money was just poured into the space program. They were hiring engineers, mathematicians, anybody, scientists, to try to help them figure out what it would take to get us into space. In 1961, by just a little bit of time, Yuri Gagarin, I think that was how you say his name, was the first human into space. So is this an American? No, this is Soviet Union. So they didn't make it first, but then a few weeks later, U.S. Sent through Project Mercury, Alan Shepard was the first U.S. man in space. And then in 1962, John Glenn is the first one to complete full orbit of the Earth. So I sent you the link to NASA the other day. There's so many things you can find on there. If you're interested in this, please look up news clips, look up all kinds of, there are videos to be found that tells you more about this. This is really interesting. Think about people doing something for the first time. Wow, how scary and thrilling it would be to be the first person going up into space. I mean, terrifying, but cool. I wish I had a better word, but cool. Many people say this is one of the most important things Kennedy did in his whole term. In August 1963, he signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty with Great Britain and the Soviet Union. And this was a treaty, an agreement that all three nations were agreeing that they would not test their nuclear weapons in outer space, underwater, or in the atmosphere. So it wasn't limiting it completely. It's called a partial nuclear ban treaty, but it was a step. It was an important step in the right direction to controlling these nuclear weapons that now everybody knows that we hold. So it was a step in the right direction to say, okay, guys, we have got to live. This is one Earth, and we can't just blow it up. We can't be blowing up everybody. So we need to make a step in the right direction of living at peace. And that's what this was. Then right after that, in just a few months, November 22nd, JFK was in his motorcade, which is a group of cars driving in Dallas, Texas, and they were waving at the crowd. And Jackie, this was one of the few times that Jackie was with him. She wasn't with him a lot of times. She was sitting beside him, and they were waving at the crowd, and he was shot, I think 3 times by Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald very quickly after that shot an officer. He was caught and arrested under suspicion that he was the one who assassinated Kennedy. And then he was then when he was being transported to trial or something, he was shot by someone. So he didn't even make it to jail because he was killed by somebody else who said that he was upset over what he did to Kennedy. But there were all kinds of different, there's lots of rumors over that there was more people involved than just one person, and there are some rumors that think that possibly this man shot Lee Harvey because he didn't want him to tell the secret of who all was in on it. But even this man died shortly from his own health problems. I think before, either not long after he went to jail or before he went to jail. Kennedy is buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington. That is, lots of soldiers and presidents are buried there. And he has beside his grave the eternal flame that is supposed to never go out. And it is honoring his life and in memory of his assassination. So we have a very sad ending here, and LBJ is sworn in as president hours after this happens. Jackie is standing there when he was sworn in on Air Force One, which is the president's plane. And then very quickly she has to move herself and her 2 children out of the White House and to live on their own and figure out life, new life for themselves. Okay, give me a quick message today on a question that you have or something interesting. I want to see your brains engaging today on what we talked about. Give me a good question or something you thought was interesting or a fact that you have that we don't have. And I hope you'll continue to follow me through the presidents through the summer. Have a great summer.